If you've ever built a PC or needed to reinstall Windows, you've probably seen them. Those suspiciously cheap Windows keys advertised all over the internet. $5, $10, maybe $20 if they're feeling generous. Windows 10 Pro for the price of a sandwich. Windows 11 for less than a movie ticket. Meanwhile, Microsoft wants $139 for Windows 11 Home and $199 for Windows 11 Pro. So what's the deal? Are these cheap keys legitimate? Are they legal? Will they actually work? And most importantly, should you buy one? Today, we're going to dive deep into the world of gray market Windows keys, and by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what you're getting into if you decide to go down that road. Let's start with the obvious question. How can these websites sell Windows keys for such ridiculously low prices? Microsoft charges between $100 and $200 for a retail license, and yet you can find keys for under $10 on dozens of websites. Kingen, G2A, CD keys, random sellers on eBay and Amazon, even sketchy-looking websites with names you've never heard of. The math doesn't add up, right? Well, that's because these keys aren't coming through the same channels as legitimate retail copies. There are several sources for these cheap keys, and understanding where they come from is crucial to understanding the risks. The first, and probably most common source, is volume licensing keys. These are called MAKE keys, which stands for Multiple Activation Key, or KMS keys, which stands for Key Management Service. These are keys that Microsoft sells in bulk to large organizations, businesses, schools, and enterprises. The way it works is simple. A company buys a volume license agreement with Microsoft. Instead of buying individual retail keys for every computer, they get special keys that can activate hundreds or thousands of machines. It's cheaper per license because they're buying in bulk. Now, here's where things get shady. Some of these volume license keys end up being sold individually on gray market websites. How? Well, sometimes an IT administrator at a company might have access to these keys and decides to make some money on the side by selling them. Sometimes the keys are leaked or stolen from companies. Sometimes they're purchased from companies that went out of business and had unused activation counts. And sometimes they're obtained through even more questionable means that we'll get to in a minute. The problem with volume license keys is that they're not meant for individual consumers. They're meant to be managed by an organization's IT department and activated through corporate servers. When you use a MAK key, it phones home to Microsoft's activation servers and checks how many activations are left on that key. If the count hasn't been exceeded, it activates your Windows. But here's the catch. Microsoft can see that this volume license key is being used outside of its intended organization. And at any point, they can deactivate it. Maybe it happens in a week, maybe a month, maybe a year, or maybe never. It's a gamble. Some people use these keys for years without issue. Others get deactivated after the next major Windows update. KMS keys are even more problematic. These keys require a connection to a key management service server that the organization is supposed to maintain on their network. The key only stays activated if your computer can check in with this KMS server every 6 months. Obviously, if you bought a KMS key from some guy on the internet, you don't have access to that corporate KMS server. So either the key won't work at all, or the seller has set up their own KMS emulation server, which is definitely not legal and could expose your computer to security risks if you're connecting to some random server run by who knows who. The second source of cheap keys is geographic arbitrage. Microsoft doesn't charge the same price for Windows in every country. In countries with weaker currencies or lower average incomes, Windows might cost the equivalent of $20 or $30 instead of $200. This is intentional. Microsoft wants to make their software affordable in developing markets. The problem is that some resellers figured out they could buy keys in these cheaper countries and sell them in more expensive markets for a profit while still undercutting Microsoft's official pricing. Now, is this illegal? That's actually a complicated question. Microsoft's license agreement prohibits this, but whether it violates actual law depends on the jurisdiction and how the courts interpret digital goods resale. It's definitely against Microsoft's terms of service, which means Microsoft can deactivate these keys if they detect them. And they have gotten better at detecting regional keys being used in the wrong regions. Your computer's IP address gives away your location, and Microsoft's activation servers can flag keys that were sold for one region, but are being activated in another. The third source is OEM keys. OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturer. These are the keys that come pre-installed on computers from Dell, HP, Lenovo, and other manufacturers. When you buy a laptop with Windows already on it, that's an OEM license. The way Microsoft's licensing works, OEM licenses are tied to the specific hardware they came with. They're not supposed to be transferred to a different computer. They're also significantly cheaper than retail licenses because they're sold in bulk to manufacturers, and the support burden is on the manufacturer, not Microsoft. So where do cheap OEM keys come from? Sometimes they're pulled from old computers that are being recycled or refurbished. Sometimes they're from computers that were built but never sold. Sometimes they're legitimate surplus from manufacturers. And sometimes they're just fake stickers that someone printed. The problem with buying an OEM key is that even if it activates, Microsoft can detect that the hardware doesn't match the hardware the key was originally assigned to, and they can deactivate it. Also, OEM keys are technically non-transferable. So even if you're buying a legitimate unused OEM key, you're still violating Microsoft's license terms by using it on different hardware than it was intended for. Then we get into the really dark stuff. Some of these cheap keys are purchased with stolen credit cards. Here's how that scam works. A criminal gets access to stolen credit card information. They use those cards to buy legitimate Windows keys directly from Microsoft or authorized retailers. Then they quickly sell those keys on gray market websites before the credit card fraud is discovered. When the chargebacks happen and the cards are reported stolen, Microsoft deactivates those keys, but by that time, the criminal has already made their money and disappeared. You're left with a deactivated copy of Windows and no recourse because you bought from some anonymous seller on a marketplace website. This is actually one of the more common sources of those ultra-cheap keys you see for $5 or $10. No legitimate source can sell Windows keys for that little. The only way it makes economic sense is if the keys were obtained fraudulently and the seller is trying to flip them quickly before they get caught. And here's the thing, when you buy one of these keys, you're not just getting something that might not work. You're potentially funding criminal activity. Your money is going to someone who stole credit card information. There's also the possibility of malware and security risks. Some sellers don't just sell you a key. They offer to sell you a USB drive or a download link with a pre-modified version of Windows that supposedly makes installation easier or bypasses activation requirements. This is where things get dangerous. These modified versions of Windows can contain anything. Keyloggers, backdoors, cryptocurrency miners, ransomware. You're essentially installing an operating system from an untrusted source and giving it complete control over your computer. Even if the Windows key itself works, you have no idea what else might be running on your system. Now let's talk about the marketplaces themselves. Websites like Kingwin and G2A present themselves as legitimate marketplaces where various sellers offer their products. They're quick to say that they're just providing a platform like eBay or Amazon and that they're not responsible for what individual sellers are doing. A Kingwin representative actually told Thomas Hardware that buying from them is like buying designer clothes from TJ Maxx. Just getting surplus inventory at a discount. No big deal. But that comparison is misleading. When TJ Maxx buys surplus Nike shoes, Nike knows about it. There's a paper trail. It's a legitimate business transaction. The gray market. Windows key ecosystem doesn't work that way. Microsoft isn't selling surplus keys to these marketplaces. These keys are ending up there through channels that Microsoft explicitly prohibits in their licensing agreements. The marketplaces know this. They just don't care because they make money on every transaction regardless of whether the key eventually gets deactivated. To their credit, some of these marketplaces do have policies to replace keys if they don't work or get deactivated shortly after purchase. But that's not a guarantee. Customer service quality varies wildly. Some people report easy replacements, others report being ignored or getting the runaround. And even if you do get a replacement key, there's no guarantee that one won't also get deactivated eventually. You're playing a never-ending game of whack-a-mole. So what's Microsoft's actual stance on all this? Officially, Microsoft is very clear. Keys that are sold significantly below retail price are likely not legitimate. Microsoft specifically warns about keys sold on auction sites, classified ads, or marketplace websites. They state that these keys may not work, may already be in use, or may be blocked in the future. Microsoft's official position is that you should only buy from Microsoft directly or from authorized Microsoft partners like Amazon, Best Buy, Newegg, and other established retailers. But here's what's interesting. Microsoft's enforcement of this is inconsistent. They don't have a dedicated anti-piracy team going around deactivating every questionable key. They rely mostly on automated systems that flag certain patterns. Sometimes those systems catch gray market keys quickly. Sometimes they never catch them at all. It's unpredictable. And that unpredictability is part of what makes this whole ecosystem continue to exist. If Microsoft deactivated every gray market key within 24 hours, the market would collapse because nobody would buy them. But because plenty of people use these keys for months or years without issue, the market thrives on that uncertainty. There's also the question of what actually happens if your key does get deactivated. Your computer doesn't stop working. You don't lose access to your files or programs. Windows just goes into an unactivated state. You'll see a watermark in the bottom right corner of your screen saying, "Your copy of Windows is unactivated." You won't be able to personalize certain settings like your wallpaper, colors, or themes. And you'll get occasional reminders to activate Windows. But functionally, Windows continues to work. You'll still get security updates, you'll still get feature updates, your programs will still run. It's annoying, but it's not catastrophic. In fact, this brings up an important point that not enough people talk about. You don't actually need to activate Windows at all. You can download Windows 10 or Windows 11 directly from Microsoft's website. For free, install it on your computer, and just never enter a product key. Microsoft allows this. They want people using Windows even if they're not paying for it, because it maintains their ecosystem dominance and reduces piracy of older Windows versions. The unactivated version has those limitations I mentioned, the watermark and the lack of personalization options, but it's fully functional otherwise. So if you're on a tight budget and you're considering buying a cheap gray market key just to get rid of that watermark, ask yourself if it's really worth the risk. You could spend $20 or $30 on a questionable key that might work forever or might get deactivated next month. Or you could just live with the watermark and save that money for something else. It's not the answer everyone wants to hear, but it's an honest option. Now, let's talk about the ethical dimension. Setting aside the legal questions and the risk of deactivation, is it morally wrong to buy these keys? This is where it gets complicated and people have different opinions. Some people argue that Microsoft is a massive corporation worth trillions of dollars, and if they're going to charge $200 for software that costs them virtually nothing to distribute, then buying from gray market sellers is victimless civil disobedience. Others argue that you're potentially funding criminal operations, and that buying stolen or fraudulently obtained keys is ethically no different from buying stolen physical goods. There's also an interesting argument that buying gray market keys is actually worse than pirating Windows outright. A Microsoft employee once reportedly said that if you're going to use Windows without paying, it's better to just pirate it than to buy from gray market sellers. The logic is that, at least with piracy, you're not giving money to scammers and criminals. You're just using software without paying for it, which Microsoft has shown they'll tolerate to a certain extent. But when you buy a $5 key from a shady website, you're potentially funding credit card fraud, you're supporting a black market ecosystem, and you still might end up with deactivated Windows anyway. You get the worst of both worlds. Let's talk about some specific scenarios and what I'd recommend in each case. If you're building a new gaming PC and you have the budget, honestly, just buy a legitimate license. You can get OEM licenses from Amazon or Newegg for around $100. That's still significantly cheaper than Microsoft's retail price, and it's actually legitimate. Yes, OEM licenses are technically tied to your hardware and are not supposed to be transferred if you upgrade your motherboard, but in practice, Microsoft's enforcement of this is minimal. Plenty of people use OEM keys across multiple builds without issue. You can also find legitimate retail licenses on sale occasionally for around $120 to $140. If you're a student, check if your school offers Windows licenses for free or at a steep discount. Many universities have agreements with Microsoft that provide Windows to students at no cost through a program called Microsoft Imagine or Azure Dev Tools for Education. If you're a teacher or work in education, similar programs exist for you. There are legitimate ways to get Windows cheap or free if you qualify. If you're really strapped for cash and can't afford even a discounted legitimate license, here's my honest advice. Just use Windows unactivated. Install it, skip the product key entry, and live with the watermark. Put that $20 or $30 towards something that actually matters, like a better SSD or more RAM. The performance difference between activated and unactivated Windows is zero. The only difference is cosmetic and the inability to change certain personalization settings. For many users, that's a perfectly acceptable trade-off. If you absolutely cannot stand the watermark and you're determined to buy a cheap key despite everything I've said, then at least do it with your eyes open. Understand that you're taking a risk. The key might work fine forever, or it might get deactivated tomorrow. Don't buy from sellers offering keys for $5 or $10 because those are almost certainly fraudulent. If you're going to roll the dice, at least buy from one of the more established gray market sites like Kingin, where there's some semblance of customer service if things go wrong. Read reviews. Check how long the seller has been active. Look for sellers with thousands of transactions and high ratings. And whatever you do, never download Windows from anywhere other than Microsoft's official website. Don't use modified ISOs. Don't use pre-activated versions. Don't download activation tools or cracks. The risk of malware is just too high. Always get your Windows installation files directly from Microsoft, and only use product keys to activate it. This way, at worst, you might end up with deactivated Windows. You won't end up with a compromised system full of malware. Here's something else to consider. The Windows key market exists in the form it does because Microsoft's pricing strategy creates this massive gap between official retail price and what people are willing to pay. $140 for Windows 11 Home is genuinely expensive, especially for budget builders. If Microsoft priced Windows at $50 or $60, the gray market would largely disappear because the price difference wouldn't be worth the risk and hassle. But Microsoft has clearly calculated that they make more money with high retail prices and tolerating a certain amount of gray market activity than they would with lower prices and better enforcement. In a way, Microsoft's inconsistent enforcement of their license terms enables this whole ecosystem. They could crack down much harder if they wanted to. They could deactivate suspicious keys more aggressively. They could require phone activation for all licenses. They could implement more restrictive DRM. But they don't, because having millions of people using Windows, even if they're not paying full price, is better for Microsoft than having those people switch to Linux or Mac. Windows dominance is worth more than the lost revenue from people buying cheap keys. The irony is that for all the hand-wringing about gray market keys, Microsoft themselves created a loophole that many people use. Windows 7 and Windows 8 keys still work to activate Windows 10 and Windows 11. If you have an old laptop with a Windows 7 sticker on it, you can use that key to activate Windows 11 on a completely different computer. Microsoft officially ended the free upgrade program years ago, but they never closed this back door. Why? Because, again, they want people on Windows 10 and Windows 11, even if it means allowing this technically against the rules activation method. So where does this leave us? The truth about cheap Windows keys is complicated. They're not technically legal in most cases because they violate Microsoft's licensing terms, but they're also not illegal in the sense that you're not going to get arrested for using one. They often work, at least initially, but they carry the risk of deactivation. They might be funding criminal activity, or they might just be surplus keys from legitimate sources. There's no way to know for sure. What I can tell you is this. If someone is offering you Windows for $5, something is definitely wrong. That price point only makes sense if the key was obtained fraudulently. If you see keys in the $20 to $40 range, there's a decent chance they're volume license keys or regional keys that might work but might also get deactivated. If you're paying $80 to $100 from a reputable retailer like Amazon or Newegg for an OEM license, you're probably fine, even though it's technically supposed to stay with the original hardware. The safest route is always to buy directly from Microsoft or an authorized partner. Yes, it costs more, but you get a legitimate retail license that you can transfer between computers. You get official Microsoft support if you need it, and you never have to worry about deactivation. For a lot of people, that peace of mind is worth the extra money. But I also understand that not everyone is in a financial position to drop $200 on Windows. If that's you, my recommendation is to use Windows unactivated rather than risk money on questionable keys. It's free, it's legal, it works perfectly fine, and the only downside is cosmetic. Or explore legitimate discount options like student licenses, work benefits, or sales on authorized websites. The bottom line is this. Those $5 Windows keys are too good to be true. The $20 keys are a gamble. The $100 OEM keys from Amazon are probably fine. And if you want zero risk, buy from Microsoft directly. Now you know exactly what you're getting into with each option, and you can make an informed decision based on your own risk tolerance and budget. Just don't go into it thinking you're getting some amazing deal with no downsides. There are always trade-offs. The question is, which trade-offs you're willing to accept.